I am glad you asked that, because when I asked it to Hayden, I was not, I didn't think he really answered the question. And of course, when you ask a question, it's because you already have some ideas of what you think the answer should be.
Right.
Um, and to my mind, I asked it because, one of the suppositions of meta history, one of the really interesting things that came out of it is his idea that the form or the mode of historical narrative needs to be matched, or at least have an impact on the historical moment when it's happening. Uh, One of the critiques is that the problem with history in the 20th century is it was written in a 19th century realist mode, but the 20th century was a century of modernism. You needed to have a modernist mode in order to take it up. But the reason I asked this is because, I actually thought now in the 21st century, there are so many new tools and forms and ways of constructing a historical narrative. And if you imagine doing something online, like Shazad Bashir's
Right.
recent book, which works in constellations and has video and audio, the form just is let loose in ways that was unimaginable at the time that Meta History was published. And so I really wanted Hayden to think about these new possibilities that would allow history to become something quite different potentially, and the way that the issues he raised, the possibilities he raised in meta history, could actually be taken up in a much more satisfactory way. Although it also was a slight, I don't want to say critique, but I had some suppositions that a problem with meta history and even the modernist idea is, if you're going to write a history that looks like Proust or Wolff, or in the form of aphorisms, that's a very hard thing to read. And one would imagine a hard way to make a kind of argument that at least is satisfying in terms of the pleasure principle. Whereas what we can do with hypertext and multimedia actually allows one to operate in a way that could be kinder or gentler in the didactic
Right.
purposes of history for the audience.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it did come too soon, although obviously it certainly made its mark in its time. So maybe not.
Yeah. Yeah. So this kind of like leads me to another question, which is, um, the emphasis on the form that White, so remarkably established. Do you think that it changed the way that history was taught, particularly in U.S. departments, right? Because it was super
Yeah,
critiqued by historians, right? And Hayden didn't even get a job in history departments after that.
yeah, it's true. I mean, the did it change the way? Well, I mean, it certainly did change the. Eventually, everyone had to take it up. The sense that that the formal aspects, or the way the narrative is constructed, the way the historical argument is constructed, the rhetorical parts of the argument uh, became visible in ways that perhaps they weren't. Historians didn't really want to think about it, but one of Hayden's really important claims was that, like it with literature, you have literary criticism and you have literary theory, and history is a form of writing, and as such warrants or needs a kind of historical criticism and historical theory to look at the way it's constructed. Um, and you're absolutely right. History departments ran from this, and they were worried that he was demoting history to the level of fiction,
Right.
which is different than saying it's a form of literature. But we could talk more about that. Um, and really were quite resistant to it. But over time, it became sort of this immovable force, and a realization that, yes, of course, uh, it is constructed in these ways. It does use these rhetorical techniques. We do have to think about it, if only to dismiss it and put it over there. And meta history, at least the introduction, is taught. Now, why it's taught, we can talk about. It's seen as something that has to be taken up, and I think that was a massive change. Even just the idea that we had to take up the questions of the form was a massive shift and a massive change in American history departments and the American historical discipline. Though, as you suggest, I think the places where really gained traction were in departments of literature, in interdisciplinary studies, with some theorists and philosophers of history, more so than with uh, card-carrying historians. You don't tell it. Hayden was very clear that he didn't think that's how it worked. And this led many historians to worry that what he was saying is that they were making it up, right, that they were just, cutting it out of whole cloth. And that they found very worrisome, problematic, dangerous. I don't think that's what Hayden White was arguing in meta history or in other works. I think he was saying you find all sorts of things in archives and in other texts. You can find almost anything, but it's how you assemble them that's going to be important. It's not a matter of making it up. Although historians do that too, because of course you have to fill in all the gaps, right? So it's not as though historians don't do that. Yeah. So Richard Vann, who was my predecessor at Wesleyan, was the editor-in-chief of History and Theory, and in fact was the person responsible for the Burden of History being published. And the Burden of History is sort of the kernel out of which the great oak of meta history grew. Dick Vann, in a piece, wrote that he thought that White's work had absolutely no impact on historiographical production. At least he found no empirical evidence that anyone tried to replicate what White was doing in meta history anywhere. And Hayden was found that quite problematic because he didn't think that's the way the impact was going to happen. And we could talk a little bit about sort of where meta history succeeds and fails. But in my view, I do think there was a big impact, and the impact is sort of a hard to disentangle whether it's entirely Hayden, but it coincided with the introduction of the works of Foucault in the United States, to a lesser extent, the works of Derrida, the works of Roland Barthes, which were very, very important in rethinking how historical discourse works, the epistemological framework in which it works. And then you also had a group of what I would call very literary-minded historians, like Natalie Zeman Davis and Emmanuel Ladurie, and even Carlo Ginzburg, even though Ginzburg and White completely disagree, who were trying to do micro-histories or works like The Return of Martin Guerre, where there is a lot of imagination involved in what you do with the archive, and the writerliness is very important. And so because all of a sudden you had this shift of emphasis toward what people do with language and words, White's work obviously was on the forefront of that, right, and people took up meta history and then really, the content of the form and other works, tropics, and saw this as the way of trying to understand and disentangle the relationship between language and the project of representing the past. And this did have, I think, a huge effect, especially in cultural history at first, and intellectual history, and then managed to trickle down. I do think it has become incredibly, I don't know whether to say diluted or defanged, because it's usually now used as a sort of nod toward the way this is assembled or put together, and then you go on and do your realist narrative history, having buried that in your introduction, and then reminding us of it in your conclusion. So you end up with a kind of a theory and history sandwich.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely the case. History and Theory is an interesting one because it, preceded meta history. The Burden of History was published in it. It really was that was sort of a bomb that went off in disciplinary history and philosophy of history. It's not. One should remember that White also was deeply interested in American analytic philosophy as well. as in, historiography and then French theory. And so he really constructed an interesting and explosive cocktail that then sort of blew up in meta history, although you could see it coming together in a more existential form in The Burden of History. But it changed where history and theory was going. A journal that had been before really discussing questions of covering laws and whether history is a science or what kind of a science became increasingly issue in these questions of narrative and narrativism, and then the linguistic turn. So it did push history and theory in a different direction. And it also, I think, had a lot to do with making history and theory the journal of record, since they were the ones who caught this in advance. It gave them a kind of sense that that's the place to go to find out where to make things happen. And of course, Quentin Skinner also published an early piece, so it wasn't an isolated instance, and it really is a tribute to the editorial board who was at work at that time. But as you say, then of course, rethinking history, we shouldn't downplay how important Keith Jenkins and Alan Munslow were in the creation of that journal. But I think the space, you could certainly argue, was created by meta history. That all of a sudden there was a space for different and innovative ways of trying to take up the past. And then with the Journal of Philosophy of History, that comes later when Frank Ankersmit really does think that these issues and the space, again, sort of the oxygen was provided by White and meta history, but Ankersmit really wanted to try and create a space solely for the philosophical reflection on that, whereas history and theory and rethinking history saw themselves as very interdisciplinary spaces. Journal of Philosophy of History, while certainly happy to take submissions from any kind of scholar, really wanted to press into the kind of philosophical questions that works like meta history and others bring to the fore. So but then there's other journals too. I mean, Critical Inquiry certainly was impacted, and Hayden published a lot in Critical Inquiry. And then you could think of journals like Representations and New Literary History coming in literature departments, where Hayden's work was very important. You'd say meta history might have been, and I haven't done the intellectual history, I can't say, but a conjecture is that meta history was really important for the creation of new historicism. The idea that in literary departments, they're going to take up the historical questions, and they have the abilities to do so, which they surely do. So in terms of all of these journals, you'd have to really cash it out. But my intuition is that, it definitely had an impact. It definitely led to a new historical sensibility and a different kind of historical sensibility that then sort of had a reciprocal feedback loop working between them to reestablish the field and allow journals like History and Theory to really flourish going forward. Yeah, I've called it an allergy in the past. I've gotten myself into trouble by referring it to it as an allergy. I mean, there's a story here, and I guess my readers my short version would be to say that in the United States you had this really weird occurrence of a kind of Ronchian understanding of the discipline of history wed with what the philosopher, an opponent of Ronca, Droysen's notion of historique. Now, historique is really interesting because it's a theoretical work, Droysen's historique, and it's also a methodological work. But those students, American students who went to Germany to study and then came back and became very important in founding the American Historical Association, actually saw them as these sort of twins that fit together. Ronca provides the objective aspect of it. Droysen provides the methodological one. You don't really need any theory or philosophy because we're much closer to a science, an objective science. And that's the foundation, in a way, of the American historical discipline. And it sort of had a kind of imperial effect moving out, but in a way where the history departments never never shifted that position. I mean, White famously said they apply a Fabian tactic. This is to say they're always in infinite retreat. So when someone comes to criticize them for this, they'll say, "Yeah, well, of course you're right. We understand it's not completely. We can't really bring it back. There's epistemological uncertainty," and then they go about and do their stuff in their own way, anyways. It's uncanny, the resistance. You know, for me, I've had a kind of quixotic relationship with history departments, precisely because I keep sort of coming back to try to say it's, you know, a lot of these are category mistakes, or there's things that where these people who are the pillars of your discipline actually were really interested in these other questions.
Right.
Lots of other history departments around the world really are interested in these questions. You know, why aren't you? And they say, well, we are. Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a tough one. You know, because as you rightly pointed out, metahistory is a really interesting work. On the one hand, as we were saying, it's really about the idea that you could look at a historical work like a literary work, that you could understand its mechanisms and its intentions by the formal aspects of it. Um, and this, of course, cracks open all sorts of possibilities that really do fall into that post-structuralist vein. But on the other hand, when you get into the nitty gritty, not the 45-page introduction, but the 300 pages of analysis, it's incredibly formal and structural, and I think problematic in how limiting it is, because on that reading, there's really a finite number of ways that a historical work can be imploded. There's a finite number of tropes. There's a finite number of rhetorical gestures, whether it's metonymy or metaphor, synecdoche. And depending on how those line up, they define what that work is politically and ideologically. It's incredibly restrictive. And I would say that's the part that White, I mean, at least what he said to me is like he was interested to see if he could do it. And he could, but it's not the part that actually he carried forward out of that work. He gave up on that sort of limiting and formal aspect of it. So I'd say the structural part is the part that one could say, well, that's of a moment. But this post-structural part, this idea that really comes out in the content of the form, the idea that the way it's put together, the epistemological coordinates that are taken up to make it, the way it fits into a larger web of semantic meaning, these are things that I think are incredibly useful tools for us today. I think they're underused by historians, and they're the sort of thing that then can break the spell of realism, because then you have to ask, why is the realist mode the best mode for telling this particular story? And it might be part of your work as an historian is actually not taking that to be an axiomatic or underlying naturalized truth, but saying, okay, well, why am I going to implot this? Why am I going to present this as in terms of realism, as opposed to jumping back and forth, imagining, constructing it more like, the Odyssey or the Iliad or something like that. Or, as some people are doing now with hyperlinks, where the argument just works in a totally different way and not a very real way, if you want to sort of imagine a 19th century novel.
Right.
So,
right.
Right. I mean, that again, it's great and fascinating, and there is a long intellectual history to be told. But I do think those are really interesting twins, because whereas meta history is so sort of structural and post-structural, so the post-structural is conserved all the way through, the practical past is almost a return to the existential questions that he was asking earlier on and in The Burden of History. So the question moves away from what are the forms that disciplinary history takes to a different kind of question about how can we take up the past so it's important for each of us on an individual level. That's a fundamentally different question, but it turns out the apparatus that he uses to get there really conserves those ways of understanding the structures of the past, the structures of representing the past, the different ways that one can represent the past, where things like novels and movies or songs become increasingly important in the way we, individually take up our past and make sense of it. And so White really shifts the emphasis. And, I would argue that that's also part of his rejection of disciplinary history, whereas in meta history and the burden of history, he's kind of a reformer. Mm-hmm. He's trying to show historians what they can do to bring their discipline into the 20th century and letting them know that it's just historically contingent, that it grew up the way it did, and there's no reason it has to stay what it was, to a sense that, if they want to do that stuff and talk about those things, they can do that. They're a cadre of little scientists. I'm interested in actually what people need to make the past meaningful for them to take up, say, political causes or ethical causes. And the way to do that is, for him, via this idea of the practical past. It conserves, as you suggest, many of the tools that he sort of discovered in meta history. It leaves behind this formal structuralism and instead takes up these more existential questions.
Yeah.
Who we are, what are we going to do, what are the choices we're going to make? Yeah. Well, I mean, as I alluded to before, I do think at a certain point he saw himself as trying to be a kind of a shepherd for the disciplinary flock. And Eva Domanska has argued this is a very patriarchal understanding of the role of theory of history. And she puts me in that category as well, that we somehow see ourselves as saviors of the discipline if we just had enough theory. And so she thinks maybe that's going down the wrong road. And she surely has a point. But as he moved along, of course, he became less and less interested in what disciplinary historians did. And as you suggest, disciplinary historians became less interested in what he was saying, or at least they weren't going to take his current work seriously. They would take his past work, and that's what historians do. But the reason the question keeps coming up, and I think the reason we're grappling with it now, is I really do think that disciplinary history is misaligned fundamentally with what the wider public want from the past, but also the modes of argument that they actually find convincing. Going back to sort of the authority of the expert and these 19th century notions of how it works aren't meeting our moment anymore. And here is where I think Hayden was incredibly right, that disciplinary history is a historically contingent discipline. It made sense at a certain time and place. That time and place has passed. That may be why, at least in the States, you see declining enrollments in history departments, but you see increasing enrollments in other departments that are interested in taking up the past. And so I would say if we want to save it, we got to change it. And that historians need to look to other approaches. They need to look at other modes of argumentation. They need to reinvent or reinvigorate how we gather and represent the past, and crucially, how we make the past relevant for the present and the future. And I guess I could give one example where I think White's work is at play. So Maria Inés de la Greca, in her work, is taking up so many aspects of Hayden White's project, but she's actually problematizing it by creating a kind of, if not a dialogue, an intersection of White's work and White's close friend Judith Butler's work. And so that you end up with a Butlerian analysis of certain aspects of relationality that then get sort of employed in a Whitean view of how the past is going to be brought forward. And it's incredibly inventive. And I think that's the point, or at least that would be the last point I would want to make, is that Hayden really hated hagiographical accounts of his work. He didn't want people to rehearse his arguments. He wanted people who would argue with him or use his arguments or think about his arguments. In fact, to work with meta history and against meta history in a way that would inspire us and really move us forward. And so, I mean, for me, the enduring legacy of meta history is that it says you really can try something fundamentally new,
Right.
something fundamentally different, and something really bold.
Yeah.
And that if you do that, can shift the terrain on which we do history. You can make a huge impact, but you just need the courage to do it. And that's something Hayden White had. And I think, looking at meta history, even now, when you read it, I mean, you can argue with it and say all sorts of things, but it's an incredibly inventive and courageous piece of scholarship. Can I say the one thing that I think all history departments should teach? They should teach, they should have courses in creative writing, or if not in creative writing, in, say, filmmaking or podcasting. And it shouldn't be tied to any kind of the disciplinary conventions of history. It should be just about learning to find your voice and present your material and imagine how you're going to connect with your audience. Because I think that's a key aspect of what we're doing. It unlocks the imagination. That really can help you think differently. Why don't we do that?